Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. Live on the phone with me today, I have Gayle Laakmann McDowell in Palo Alto, California. Gayle is the founder and CEO of CareerCapcom and author of multiple interview books, including Cracking the Coding Interview, Cracking the PM Interview, and Cracking the Tech Career. Her background is in software development with an undergraduate and graduate degrees in computer science from the University of Pennsylvania and an MBA from the Wharton School. She previously worked as a software engineer at Google, Microsoft, and Apple. Gayle, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Well, I mentioned before we got started, I'm really excited to talk with you. I think that your advice is really going to help a lot of our listeners who are interested in technology, and you have such a great background to really speak from this perspective. So the first question I wanted to ask is oftentimes, in kind of coding interviews or sort of development interviews, how common do you think it is to be asked to actually write code during the interview?
It does depend on the company. There are certainly companies which don't do it, but it's definitely extremely common to be asked. And the reason is that, simply put, you don't, despite somebody having a background as a coder, you don't really know that they're actually qualified to do it. And so it seems much like having an actor audition. And they want to see that you can write code, and they'll evaluate your coding style and your ability to translate a algorithm or process into code. And it doesn't mean that you always have to have flawless code, but they do want to see that you're demonstrating good coding skills.
Right. So when you're asked to code, is it typically in front of other people, or is it in a room by yourself, or is it at home? Like, what's sort of the format that's typical?
The standard process is to be, the standard process, the one that's used at Google and Facebook and a lot of other big tech companies, as well as smaller companies, is actually to write code on a whiteboard. And they do this because it helps encourage candidates to talk out loud and communicate more. And whereas if you give them a computer, they often shut down or they get very focused on things that don't matter. When someone's on a whiteboard, I don't need to worry. They're less likely to worry about if this message is actually called, insert or add or all these other things that don't really matter that much. So it helps me see kind of the meat of their code without them getting too distracted.
Right.
That said, there certainly are some companies which give you computers or have you do take-home tests as well.
Okay. And what happens, say we're in that interview and we've got the whiteboard there, and what if we're just kind of stumped and we don't know the answer? I mean, what should we say in that case?
It's a great question. And the thing I'd like to remind candidates is that this question they have about what should I do if I'm really stuck, is to understand that actually that's the norm. The questions are actually designed to be challenging, and so being stumped is actually the normal thing that happens. One of the things that I think is most helpful for candidates to make progress when they're struggling is to go look at particular examples. So if the problem is, given a list of people, find the year at the highest population. Look at it, come up with an example of a list of people and try to walk through it the way you might manually if I actually wrote these down on a sheet of paper. And then see if you can translate that into how a computer might do it. But you just remember that the questions are really designed to challenge you, so being a little stumped is actually very normal and doesn't mean that you're doing particularly poorly.
Great. Okay. Well, so one really exciting thing about your background is that you were once on the hiring committee at Google, and I hear from people all the time who are really interested to work at Google. I actually had a friend from college who interviewed or who wanted to work for Google for like 10 years, and he finally landed a job at Google, I think maybe 6 months ago. But I would just love to understand what makes a Google interview different than another interview for a different company.
Google is a big believer in looking at your aptitude and in hiring generalists. So Google wants to hire people who will be good in 6 months or a year or whatever, and they're actually less concerned about your current skill set. And that's part of why Google places a lot of emphasis on intelligence and problem-solving skills, is that they really believe that that's a greater predictor of your future performance than the kind of skill set you have right now. That said, a lot of the things you hear about Google, about like Google, 10 crazy Google interview questions, a lot of those are just hyped up myths that are really exaggerations. But Google still does value problem-solving skills and intelligence very highly, and they put less emphasis on your current skill set. They believe that if you're smart, you'll do good work, and you can be trained to learn to know the things that you need to know.
That's really interesting. So how do they assess intelligence, for example?
It depends on the role. So for software engineers, or for software developers, that's usually through coding and algorithm problems, as well as like design and architecture problems. For another role, like a product manager, it might be a mix of some estimation problems. So things like how many pizzas are delivered every year in Manhattan. That's just kind of a problem that that's a number that you can logically deduce an estimate from. Or it might be solving a very particularly relevant problem, like you launched this feature and this metric dropped. What went wrong? So problem-solving sort of questions, and the specific way that the question is designed will depend on the role, but they ask usually open-ended problems, or things that are basically hard and make you think a little bit.
That's really interesting. And are those often asked in front of other people, like in front of a panel? Or, are you in a room by yourself? Like, what's the format for those?
In pretty much all cases, candidates are one-on-one with an interviewer. And it's really important that candidates realize that there's a very good reason that the interviewer is not leaving the room when you solve these problems, and it's not to make you more nervous. It's to give you the opportunity to ask questions. So you should approach these problems as though these are conversations. Almost try to act like you're solving it collaboratively with the interviewer. Although obviously the interviewer kind of knows the problem better than you do. Approach them as a conversation, ask questions, expose your thought process as much as possible. It's truly not about the final answer. It's about the process you're taking to get there.
I think that's a good point. Whether you're at Google or whether you're at another company, often you're asked difficult questions that may or may not even have a real answer. And showing that thought process is really sometimes what they're looking for more than the answer.
Absolutely.
Well, so for people who may be listening that are interested to apply at Google, for example, is it best to apply online, or are there other tips in terms of how to sort of get yourself into the process of applying to Google?
What I recommend, and this is actually true for pretty much any company, but is apply any path you can. Yes, certainly apply online. It won't take too long, but realistically, that's not. You can definitely do it. It won't hurt you, but it's not generally the most useful path because it's hard to get noticed there. What's better is to try to reach out to somebody at the company. If you have a friend at the company or a friend of a friend, and you probably have a friend of a friend at any large company, try to reach out to them. I used to, a long time ago, when I was graduating from college, I would go on search engines, so on Google, and I'd search something like, if I wanted to apply to Adobe, for example, I would search recruiter space star, so like the wild card thing, so star@adobe.com. And I'd come up with names of email addresses of recruiters at Adobe. And so that was a good way of just reaching out to somebody specific. Use your college alumni network. Anything you can do. The other thing that's really important there, really useful to do, is try to make yourself known. So have a have a website, have a portfolio, have a place where people can go and look at the stuff you've done, look at the projects, and it gives me or whoever's reading your resume a better feel for who you are, and also makes us more likely to find you. So recruiters go online and they go to GitHub and read people's personal web pages, and they're looking for candidates. So make yourself discoverable that way.
No, I totally agree. I think that's some great advice. So what about if we've gone through an interview process, whether it's at Google or any other, big tech company, we're going through the process and it doesn't come together, we don't get the job. Should we just axe that company off our list and not apply again? Or how do you perceive that when we don't get the job?
Absolutely not. One thing that Google understands, and this is true at Facebook, and pretty much all the top tech companies understand, is that they've set a high bar, and they believe in setting a high bar, but they also know that setting that high bar comes with problems. And one of the problems is that good candidates are rejected, and it takes really a lot to get hired. And they say, okay, we know that we're going to reject good candidates, so we're not going to really hold that against them after some period of time has passed. Mm-hmm. So if you get rejected by Google or Facebook or any of these companies, ask your recruiter how long it takes you to be reconsidered. Usually it's either 6 months or a year. And then reach out to your recruiter after that period of time. And there are a huge number of people at Google who got rejected once. I was rejected for an internship at Google, and then I reapplied when it came to full-time, which wasn't even a year later. But I reapplied for a full-time role, and although I was rejected because of my earlier interviews, when I reapplied, they actually expedited my process because I had actually done well enough in interviews.
Oh, wow.
So you can do actually well in interviews, but not quite well enough to get hired, but well enough that they'll be really excited about re-interviewing you.
That's really interesting. Okay, that's good to know. I think a lot of people, it's a really personal rejection sometimes when you get turned away, but many times you're applying for one particular job and there may be hundreds of applicants for that job. So there are going to be qualified people who are turned away. And there's randomness too. There's so much randomness in the process, and even if you don't get rejected because of another candidate, there's so much randomness that getting rejected does not mean that you're not good. And Google knows that, Facebook knows that. They know that they turn away good people, and they want, if you do well but not quite at the bar, they want to re-interview you in 6 months or a year. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, one of your books is focused, on the PM interview. And I talk with job seekers a lot who are interested to move from one functional area, one kind of role into another. And sometimes that's product management. So, for somebody who may be listening that has never had a role in product management but would really like one, whether it's someone who's right out of college or maybe it's someone more senior that's been working in another area, do you have some suggestions on what, we could do to prepare to move into a product management type of role?
Yeah, one thing I think is really exciting about product management and actually advising people on getting roles in product management is that there is no path into it. It's if you want to be a software developer, okay, you know how to do that. You go get a CS degree or you go to a coding boot camp, and then you go learn how to code, you do some projects, and then you go, there's a path into it. There's a path into law. There's a path into all these other professions. There's no one path into product management. It's one of the most diverse roles in that sense, and that people come from all kinds of backgrounds. And what I like to sort of talk to people about with product management is that in order to get into product, in order to be the perfect product manager, the perfect background is like, you understand business. That means having maybe a business degree or something like that. You understand technology, so that means having a CS background. You understand the industry itself. So if you're applying for a product manager role at a finance company, you have a finance background. And you also have a product background. So maybe you have know how to design something. That's the ideal background, and like essentially impossible for anybody to have all those things. And so everybody who enters product management has gaps in their background. But it also means that almost anybody can enter it. So I talked to somebody on Monday night who just got her first product management job after being a lawyer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and what happened with her was she was working as a lawyer at a large tech company, and as an in-house lawyer. And a lot of what she started doing started getting closer and closer to working really closely with the product teams, to the point where she realized, hey, what she really likes to do is help build products. And so she took on some product management responsibilities within her company, even though she was not a product manager. She just worked very closely with the product teams, and eventually they opened up that opportunity to her. And once she did that, then she was able to be a product manager candidate at other companies as well. So, and I think that's what's so cool about product management, is that people come from such different backgrounds, and that, look at the ideal background, think about what I talked about there, and try to get as much coverage as you can. But nobody has perfect coverage there. It's just impossible.
That's a good point. Do you think the same thing with project management, or do you feel like that's a little different?
I think project management is a bit different. It's, the titles sound similar, and sometimes they are very similar. It really depends on the company. Project management is a bit more on the scheduling and timeline side, so it doesn't have quite the diversity that diversity in terms of backgrounds that product management does. But it's still, it's also something where there actually are there are certification courses towards project management that some companies highly value. Product management just doesn't have that.
No, yeah, I could see that. And, it's interesting. I think it may vary a little bit as well based on the part of the country that you're in. I'm in Memphis, and the talent pool here is a lot smaller. And so I think there's probably more flexibility here on some of like project management roles in terms of your background, versus I would have to assume that kind of in Silicon Valley, there are so many people with, the specific certifications that you mentioned, that you'd probably need those to be even more competitive, I would have to guess.
Right.
Yeah. Well, so speaking of certifications, there are lots of different certifications and, different advanced degrees that are available for people. I talk with different people a lot who are debating, should I go back to school or should I take a certification class? And a lot of those things take a lot of time and they take money. I'm kind of curious, what suggestions do you have for someone who may be trying to decide whether or not to go back to school, whether it's to get an advanced degree, in addition to what they have, or some kind of a certification?
It's a fascinating question, and I think what I would, my quick summary is, make sure you know exactly what that degree or that certification is getting you. I think a lot of people say, I want help getting a job, and so I'm going to go get this extra thing for my resume, and that often doesn't work out very well. In some cases, it can be kind of a waste of time. In some cases, it can be helpful, and in some cases, it can actually be detrimental. So I'll give a quick example. So I have a master's degree in computer science. I'll be honest, that did not help me at all. I spent an extra year in school, so I spent an extra, $40,000 in tuition, another $100,000 plus in lost salary, and it did not help me in any way. It was a total waste of time, especially when you consider all that money that was lost. And I wish I had somebody at the time telling me, what are you getting a master's for? It doesn't help you. And that's because I had a good degree anyway, and I really didn't need this extra credential, and Google didn't care really that I had a master's degree. So that was just kind of a neutral. It didn't add anything and ended up costing a lot. But, suppose I came from a school nobody had ever heard of, and then I was able to somehow get into Stanford for a master's degree in CS. Well, that would open up a ton of recruiting opportunities. That could be really valuable and give me a lot of prestige and credibility. So sometimes it can be really helpful. But one thing that's really important for people to understand is certifications. they can actually backfire. Some companies care about them. So if you look at companies like Oracle and companies along those lines, Oracle, American Express, kind of a lot of, the companies that are prestige-wise, not quite seen the same way as Google, Facebook, et cetera. Some of those companies can care about certifications. If you talk to people at Google, it's not just that they don't care about certifications. They care, and they can actually see them as a negative. So they will actually have a bias against people who are certified often. It depends on the role, though. So if you're a software developer and you want to get a software engineering job at Google, don't go get a certification. At least not in anything like Java or something like that. If you wanted to go get more of a IT job at Google, that may be different. So just be very, very careful and don't operate on the assumption that this extra credential will help you, because it can help you. It can also be a neutral, and it can also be even a negative.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think so often we grow up maybe with the idea that any extra certification or any extra education, it's always going to be helpful and it's going to get our foot into some door. But you make a good point in terms of you're really sacrificing something. You could be getting something on your resume that's going to give off a different perception. You could be sacrificing salary that you may be losing, or just the money that you're paying in tuition, whether it's for a certification course or for an advanced degree. I mean, there are things that you should weigh.
Right, and an interesting little story. So Google, years ago, this actually back in 2007, did a study to try to figure out what sorts of things predict strong interview performance and strong job performance. And one of the only outcomes of this was that they found that people who had certifications on their resume tended to perform worse in software development interviews.
Ooh.
And the interesting thing, I think, from it is the reaction when this study came out, when Google kind of emailed out all the results, was everybody around me who was like, well, that was obvious. And so you can debate whether or not certifications should be a negative, and that's a much more complex question. But the real point here is that interviewers assumed that people with certifications would perform poorly. So if you're applying with a certification on your resume for Google, it's probably not going to help your chances. People are biased against it, whether you think they should be or not.
Yeah, absolutely.
But again, depends on the role, depends on the company.
That's really interesting. Well, so as we're looking at these various technology jobs, oftentimes they have a ton of requirements. And so sometimes as job seekers, we may look at those minimum requirements and kind of be torn about whether or not we should apply when we don't meet the minimum standards laid out in the job description. What is your suggestion for us when we don't meet those minimum requirements?
Definitely apply. First of all, it doesn't hurt to apply, but also realize that job descriptions and requirements are often not really real. They can, I help a lot of companies on their hiring process as well, and I'll read these job descriptions and I'm like, you can't have this many years of experience in this language. It just doesn't exist. Haven't been around that long. Or you'll see people hiring managers who approach it as like, gosh, if I could, I would want to have somebody with this number of years of experience and this, and I want to have them with this, and this. And they don't really think through, I don't really need all of that. I would love it. That'd be amazing. But I'm willing to actually hire people who don't have that much.
Mm-hmm.
Because, we all do this. I just took a simple example. If I'm hiring a nanny, I would love to have them have a child development degree and also have a ton of experience with kids and also this, and this. But if you're great with kids and you don't have that, that's not going to stop me from hiring you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really the same across roles. Yes, these credentials, whatever, are nice, but I don't, I care if you're a great candidate, and it doesn't always mean having all the things I wanted in some ideal fictional world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a good point that you use the words ideal fictional world, because it is a little bit like a wish list sometimes, those job descriptions. And, it seems like sometimes a hiring manager is putting them together quickly. They may be copying and pasting, different previous job descriptions together. I mean, it may not be as scientific of a process as it may look like when you're reading that job description on the internet.
Exactly.
Right. Well, so as you've gone through this process, and whether it's, being on a hiring committee or really delving into these issues in your books, what are some of the biggest issues that you see that job seekers are making when they're going through the hiring process?
I think the biggest thing is candidates who aren't preparing enough. So I think there's a portion of candidates who, if you take a coding job, who just kind of assume that, I code, I have a good coding background, so that'll be enough. And they don't realize that they're competing against everybody else who also has a coding background. So you're going to need a little bit more than that. So make sure that, my advice is job seekers is, make sure you prepare, but also realize that a lot of, if you have questions about the process, for the most part, recruiters are actually happy to tell you things. If you are like, am I going to be coding in this interview or not? Am I going to be, am I going to have 2 phone screens or 3 or 1? Or am I going to be, if you have questions about the process, your recruiter is generally not trying to surprise you with anything. So ask them questions. Just because they didn't provide you with some information doesn't mean they have any problem doing it when you ask.
Right. No, that's a really, really good point. I mean, I think it can be such a tough process. And, I've even heard rumors, and I'd love to kind of hear your perspective, but I've heard rumors that, there are not enough coders for the jobs in Silicon Valley. And I tend to really struggle with that idea because it feels like California is such a desirable place. These are such desirable companies. I can't imagine that there's a shortage of technology people who are interested to go and take those jobs.
Yeah, it's a very popular debate. So I'll say my perspective on this is that it is certainly, companies are certainly struggling with hiring enough, especially at the top, when you start talking about companies like Google and Facebook and Dropbox. Mm-hmm. It's certainly true that they are struggling with hiring enough developers. At the same time, you go out to other places in the country and you talk to software developers and they're struggling to get jobs. Mm-hmm. So there's a mismatch here of information. And I think what it is that there are lots of developers out there in the world. There are more than enough developers. We're not having a shortage of developers. What we are is having a shortage of developers who can pass the kinds of interviews that Google and Facebook and Dropbox and these kind of companies are doing. And I think what's going on here is that there aren't enough developers who can pass those interviews, and that's because they're focusing very highly on problem-solving skills and these sort of whiteboard coding kind of things. And what one contributing factor I think is that it's out of the pool of people who are not doing, who are struggling to get jobs, it's hard to surface the good candidates from those people. So the candidates who pass the interview from those pool of people who are struggling a bit more. Mm-hmm. And so you have some people who have, a CS degree from a good university, and companies say, yes, let's interview them. And then you have all the other candidates out there who might be great, but just aren't being surfaced with the current recruiting processes.
Sure. And I think it kind of goes back to your earlier statement about, making sure that you prepare for the job interview, because even though you're a coder and you're smart and you probably stand out in the place where you live or in your company, you are going to be competing against lots of other smart coders who also stand out in their environment. So those are the people you're going up against sort of head to head in these interviews.
Exactly.
Well, I talk to people all over the country who are looking for new jobs, and a lot of them tell me that they're really interested to move to California, whether it's to, work for a startup or to work for a big tech company in Silicon Valley. That's like their dream goal for, one day. That's the ultimate thing that I want to do. If we have that kind of a goal, what suggestions do you have for us in terms of what can we do to prepare, and how can we make that dream a reality?
Yeah, so one thing I'd recommend doing is understand that the Silicon Valley recruiting process, the one that, Google and Facebook and Amazon, which are Silicon Valley companies, but are very closely related, and, Dropbox and a lot of these startups, the way that they interview is by saying, okay, how would you design an algorithm to do such and such? Start getting experience in those areas. You don't have to go back to school. There's a ton of information online about how to learn stuff, about how to learn algorithms. And so figure out what's needed, what information you need to know to get that knowledge, and start off with that. But also, if you can afford it, and so that's a big if, but if you can afford it, so if you can live if you have a month or two salary saved up, I actually really recommend people who can take that risk, just coming out to Silicon Valley. If you want to work out here one day, you'll be better off moving out here and looking for a job once you're here. You'll have a lot more opportunities open up to you than trying to recruit for Silicon Valley companies when you're not in Silicon Valley. There is just a little anecdote. There's a guy who emailed me maybe 3 years ago. It was probably maybe 6, 7 years ago now, but he emailed me. He was I think he was a programmer at some sort of small bank in the Midwest, and really wanted to one day come out to Silicon Valley and get a job out here. And I was kind of like, look, if you can afford it, come out here, just do it, take the plunge. And he's like, I don't know, I have a kid, I have 2 kids, I have a wife, blah blah. And I was like, if you can afford it, do it. If you can't, that sucks. Like, do it if you can. I can. And so finally, he did a bit of preparation for interviews. Rented a Airbnb or something like that for a month or so, and was able to get a job at as one of the early engineers at companies along the lines of Uber or Lyft, company that's now brand name, and one of the early engineers and doing phenomenally better, all because he just took that initial risk to come out here. It's obviously not a privilege that everybody has, but if you can do that, if you can afford to do that, you'll be better off than trying to recruit remotely.
So in that example, do you have any idea how long it took him to find that job after he was kind of staying in the apartment for a month or two there in California?
I think it took him about a month.
Okay.
I think he probably had multiple opportunities. If he was qualified enough to get a job at, Uber, some such company like that, I think he probably had multiple opportunities, but I think he ended up living about a month without salary.
Okay. And do you know kind of how he ended up landing that job? I mean, was it, again, just through applying online, or do you know if sort of networking was any part of his process?
So networking is certainly valuable. I think in his case, he went out there was a lot of networking. He went out to a lot of meetups and things like that and just met recruiters. The thing to understand is out in Silicon Valley, there is truly a shortage of good developers. So even companies like Google and Facebook, who you think have tons of developers just throwing themselves at the recruiters to try to get jobs, they're still struggling to hire enough people. There's just a shortage of good people. So if you can get yourself in front of a recruiter, just get them to pick up your resume and look at it, and you can show on your resume that you might be a good fit, you'll be able to get into the interviews. And so to show that you might be a good fit, think about showing good projects. So do some projects on your own, build some apps on the side, whatever. Learn multiple programming languages. Don't identify as a Java coder through and through. Learn multiple programming languages and show that you have some algorithm skills. So do some HackerRank challenges or take classes on Coursera on algorithms. Do something to show that you have that algorithm skill. And recruiters are likely to say, okay, you might be a good fit. They'll overlook other things like not having a degree. And once you're in the interview, you're on equal footing with somebody with basically any other background.
That's a great point. What you just described to me, what I heard is someone who has a more of an entrepreneurial sort of mindset around their career. Because when it comes to, say, building apps or going to these weekend, whether it's like a hackathon or something else, that's something that you have to do on your own time, and you have to come up with the idea to do it on your own, as opposed to kind of sitting back and waiting for your existing company or someone else to prompt you to do those things.
Exactly. And, entrepreneurial skills is actually, in and of itself, a good thing. One way that I encourage people to look at the sort of question of how do I get a job at blank company is that recruiters are looking essentially at two things. One is they're looking at, would you be a good fit at the company? So would you be successful here? So things like showing initiative, having good projects, things like that, things that show that you have skills, whatever, that'll go to showing you'd be successful at that company. But there's another question that a lot of candidates forget about, which is that recruiters are also looking for, will you pass our interviews? Because if a recruiter looks at your resume and they think, yeah, you'd be really successful, but I know our interviewers, and you wouldn't do well in the interview. There's no sense in you being interviewed, for better or worse. I mean, it's unfortunate, but it's true. And so look at your resume in that sense, in that you need to show that you would be successful at the company, but you also need to show that you would have a reasonable shot at passing the interview. And that's part of why, if you're a developer, doing hacker rank challenges helps show that you'd have a good shot at passing interviews like that. So don't forget about that, would you pass the interview piece too.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's important. You talked a couple times about sort of a shortage of sort of quality coders, for example. I've been told before that, one great coder is as efficient as, I don't know if it's like 4 or 5 kind of mediocre coders. I mean, do you tend to kind of agree with that, you can have this one person that's just able to do incredible work, compared to many other people?
I roughly agree with that. Mm-hmm. What I would say is that it's very hard to. I agree with it, but I also think it's kind of a weird statement,
right? Because
it implies that it's like one great developer is, 5 times as fast as a mediocre developer, and right. It's not like that. A million weak developers will not build a system that scales like Google's does.
Right.
More weak developers. It's not that, a strong developer is 5 times as good as a weak developer. You can't hire 5 weak developers and make up for you can't hire any number of weak developers and make up for a fantastic one.
Right.
At least for really hard problems.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's part of why when I work with companies, I really push them on hiring people who are not just skilled, but are smart and, equally importantly, value doing high quality work. Mm-hmm. There's a segment of developers out there who have an attitude, and it's not unique development, segment of employees out there who have an attitude that as long as it's correct, that's fine. And they don't really put high standards on themselves. And those people are almost by definition not going to do a great job.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great point. So I mentioned at the beginning, your company is CareerCapcom. Can you tell us just a little bit about your company and how we can learn more about it?
Sure. So CareerCap does a whole smattering of things around technical interviews. The biggest things is there's a CareerCap.com website that is essentially a form around interview questions. So you can go on there and see the kinds of questions that Google and Facebook and Dropbox and a whole bunch of small companies are using. So you can go in there and read about those interview questions. There's also a book, Cracking the Coding Interview, which is the major book for programming interview prep. And it's actually Amazon's best-selling interview book of all categories.
Oh, great.
And then another one for product managers as well that's very popular. And then I also do consulting to help companies through acquisition interviews. So when small startups get acquired by Google and other companies, they interview all the engineers. So I help companies with that. And I also help companies work on their hiring process and building out building up more efficient and stronger hiring processes, especially for developers.
Yeah, that's so exciting. That's got to be a really fun process to go through with those big companies as they're changing, or little companies as they're becoming bigger.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. Well, Gayle, thank you so much for joining me. This has been great.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. Tune in next week for another edition of the Copeland Coaching Podcast. And if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher so you never miss an episode.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.